Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian of Sports Info Solutions, joined by the R&D Jamboree that we call Alex Vigderman, James Weaver, and Bryce Rossler. As always, we've got our producer, Justin Stein, with us. And coming off the Super Bowl, we're going to break down the game, talk about some of the interesting things that we took away from the game and that the numbers did as well. And then we'll close out by talking about some of the coaching changes that we've seen. Not so many this year relative to other years, but we want to break down some of those, think about what we can expect as we see some of these coaches change cities. But first, before we get into it, Alex, I'm sorry, condolences. I know you are a Go Birds enthusiast. This is how it goes sometimes.
Yeah, it's how it goes sometimes. Certainly less. It's more tragic because of what's been happening to Philadelphia professional sports over the last several months. And by this trend, the Sixers will lose in the finals as well. But having won a few years ago makes it a lot less painful. And for whatever reason, I was not feeling that emotionally distraught about it, even though obviously there were just a couple of plays that really made the difference. I think there was a lot of focus on the penalty at the end of the game. I don't know that that's necessarily an appropriate point of focus. I think that not that you can place that much blame per se, but the fumble 6 was obviously a huge play that kind of got lost in the shuffle. And at the end of the day, your defense has to be able to generate. I mean, they generated some amount of pass rush in terms of pressure. The Eagles were able to get some on Mahomes, but one of the sort of big things about Mahomes is that he does not succumb to that. And he really lives up to situations in which he's under pressure, and not getting sacked at all is a pretty big problem if you're an Eagles defense.
I got to tell you, man, I'm very full of joy to hear that you are not trying to place the blame on the officials for this game. My pet peeve is I watch so much damn football this year, every year, my whole life. I love this sport. I go through practices that, all of the minutia of trying to what it takes to be really good at football and understand the game. And people that just want to turn on the Super Bowl, and specifically turn on the last 2 minutes of the Super Bowl, and then change the rules of football because they didn't like how it worked out for either their bet or their enjoyment of just what would be more interesting to them. You can't call the game based on what's more interesting. I really hate that when people come out of the woodwork and want to change all the rules based on, the NFL needs to do something about this. You can't be having calls like that. It's just this wasn't a penalty kick at the end of the game. This was one play. Was it the most egregious call? No, but when the dude who committed the penalty said it was a penalty, and I don't know if you guys saw the NFL Films video that made the whole just clear as day, which is basically from the same angle as the official who was standing by the pylon of the end zone, who was responsible for that matchup. Yeah, as you can tell, it gets me going when people want to make that the narrative when we're talking about an awesome football game, two really good teams, 38-35. What more can you ask for? And all of the different strategy that went on that we'll talk about throughout there. Yeah, you're right. The reason why they won or lost was more the fumble 6 than it was anything else.
Yeah, and it was a close game. And, as if you're talking about people who are sort of parachuting in to watch it, you can't ask for much more. And I guess if you want people to talk about it, you can't ask for much more than something to argue about in the last 2 minutes of the game. So
yeah, it's so funny. The NBA last 2 minutes, it takes forever to get through the game. Here we got through the last 5 minutes. There was a call that was the right call, and the game the team that deserved to win won the game. And I don't know, people want to make something out of that. James, I don't know, what's your take? Where did you come down on that whole debate after I just criticized anybody who disagrees with me?
Yeah, I mean, by the letter of the law, it's the right call. I guess I kind of go back to the terms of consistency, where if you're calling something throughout the whole game one way and then change it at the end, that's kind of tough to deal with. I mean, I just think of the call of Jude.
Wait, hold on. I agree. They should not have changed the way they call the game at the end of the game.
Yes.
For this sort of a reason. And to have not made the call would have been changing the way that you called the game.
See, I think of the one, I forget what quarter it was. It was the first quarter, second quarter, and on the third down play when Juju was running over the middle, and there was a blatant tug. I forget from who, and they didn't call that, and they let that go. So that's kind of the one.
So it would have been better for the Eagles if they had called both of those instead of just calling one of them.
There'd probably be less. I think there'd be less discourse and less concern if both were called. Yes.
I full disagree. I think the discourse is there because people like making stupid discourse, and it's just blatantly wrong.
But I think that's the key is the sort of like you look at one play and you want it to be called that way, and you might look at like 3 plays and you might want it to be called that way. But like the universe, sure, and we're also talking about like the universe of all plays that are kind of like that. And if you had your way and things were all called consistently, like there would be a whole bunch of plays that would look different, and you probably wouldn't be satisfied with the result in that case. So like it's not quite a butterfly effect, but it's just like there's, especially holding, it happens all the time in these small little bits. And so like asking sort of a different way of calling those plays has a huge impact on the game in a way that you probably don't want.
I agree with James. Just call it consistently throughout the game.
Hold on, everybody wants to call it consistently throughout the game. The officials are trying to call it consistently throughout the game. Can we talk about just there was like one example of people like took one snapshot and they said, oh, they should have called this one too. Because they didn't call this one, it was inconsistent. That shows a great lack of understanding of football.
Well, it also doesn't help that during the broadcast, I think the replay they showed
was not the actual thing that they called.
Yeah.
They called the second bit of contact, which could have also been holding, but the actual jersey tug was the egregious holding.
Yeah, and they did not show that on the broadcast, so that's why this discourse snowballed.
But I mean, I agree you should have consistency, but to say like, well, you missed a hold that was also a close call order earlier in the game, so we shouldn't call this at the end of the game. That's like, it's sort of like asking for your cake and eating it too, I think.
A different metaphor might be like throwing good money after bad or whatever. Like you're trying to be consistent with a thing that you probably wouldn't have wanted to do in the first place.
Right.
I think it's just tough. Like throughout the game, there wasn't anything called either. And like Alex said, there's holding on, the majority of plays. And like for that to be the one at the end, we were just letting it go the whole time. I don't know.
I'm going to go tinfoil hat. This is a makeup call. Let's talk about it.
Go on.
I'm joking. I don't think.
So because it was a relatively clean game, the fact that they made a call when there was a penalty at the end of the game is a problem. I don't know how to beat a dead horse with this, but like we're talking about a football game here where there were like many points scored and a lot of plays that decided this game. And we can't even pinpoint that in this specific instance, this guy did something wrong. We're basically saying he did something wrong by virtue of the rest of the game, the rest of the people not calling things that may or may not have been called. And like, you're going down like a really long road here where I think we could just take the shortcut, which is it was less exciting.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it too, is that people just generally do not like quote unquote officials deciding the game.
Fair.
I think that is a very fair thing to be.
But you'd like it. I mean, the thing is like, sure, but you'd like it a lot worse if guys were like beating up people and they were like, let them play. Like,
let's abolish refs. Let's move to a call your own fouls system. Do it on honor code. It'll be fun.
I mean, I am a fan of trying to let them play. And I think the NFL's done a good job about that. We are supposed to be the analytics people here. So I'll bring the conversation back to that sort of realm. Penalties per game are down over the past couple of years throughout the NFL. There is sort of like a cleaner game being played. It's a little bit analogous to what the NBA did several years ago when they made hand checking really something they were going to enforce. Yeah, you had to go through some time where you had some calls that people didn't like to hear, but then eventually people adjusted to it. You could say there's less defense, quote unquote, in the NBA now, but the style of play has adapted to how the referees call the game. The NFL has been calling less lately, and I think that's made for a better sport to watch. Obviously not when it comes to the quarterbacks getting landed on stuff and stuff like that. But in terms of holding penalties, stuff like that, I think it's made for a better sport. I think you especially want that in the playoffs. Nobody wants to watch a game with 20 penalties in the playoffs like this. So I think this crew did a really good job. They had a quiet game in terms of not otherwise affecting the outcome, not affecting the outcome with anything egregious. There may be 2 calls that you could argue about, right, in this one that were really close, but nothing really egregious. I don't know. When I think about how the sort of greater course of the game went, I think that you want referees that are going to call less and that will call things when they need to call it because it's obvious. And I think that's what happened here.
This is going to sound dumb, but we should be glad that the Super Bowl happens at the end of the season and not the beginning of the season, which is, of course, you would never do this. But the way that officiating works, right? Like in the off season, they make different choices about how they're going to enforce things. And inevitably in the preseason, and it's happened this year too, right? Like they make different choices about how they're going to call stuff, and they overcall things. And in the first
point of emphasis.
Yeah. And so like by the end of the season, things sort of even out and they kind of figure out their set point. And so like this, and to your point, like they kind of let everybody sort of like understands the ecosystem in which the game is being played, and they're able to sort of like take a step back. And so the benefit of having a long season and some of these points of emphasis is that they're really grading in the preseason, in the first couple weeks of the season, and they kind of get blended in with everything else, and things look a lot more smooth by the end of the year.
Yeah, this is what I'm about to say is like extremely gamer brain poisoned millennial, but this is like in esports, like when they have big tournaments, they don't do patch fixes in the middle of them. Like they don't make any changes to the ecosystem because it fucks everything up.
Juju knows a lot about that.
I think Juju's more of a TikTok guy than a gamer, but I don't know, maybe he's a gamer.
I'm too boomer to know the difference. Anyway, I still think you're wrong, but James, big credit to you for taking the full disagree with me in that argument. And for that reason, you are a winner.
You're fired.
If anybody's getting fired here. It's me. Taking it back, though, let's circle back to the game a little bit. What I found to be so interesting about this was a lot of the things that we were looking at coming in really, I thought, played into the narrative here. Which of these teams was going to be able to control the game? The sort of Eagles, the better team, who really wanted to control the number of possessions that were going to be played, shorten the game sort of, versus the Mahomes Chiefs, which is how can we keep him safe? How can we keep him protected? And eventually put it into a spot where they can't score as many points as we can. And I thought it was a great horse race, like as far as that went. The Eagles, both teams offensively, I thought really had their game scripts in that sense. Defensively, obviously, both of the teams struggled, and that shouldn't be a huge surprise given how good these two offenses were. But looking through things, the Eagles really were in control the whole first half. Alex pointed it out. That fumble 6 was an absolute game-changing play. Maybe nothing that happened after that point would have really mattered had it not been for that. You can just imagine how the whole game would have been different at that point. A couple of big special teams plays that sort of also played into things. I think that's something that we didn't see coming. But then when we look at the end of the game, you look at the Chiefs, what do they only have? 8 or 9 possessions in the entire game. And the Eagles had 40 minutes of possession and Mahomes barely had the ball. You would say Hurts outplayed Mahomes. We can talk about that in a second in terms of what total points thought about that. But kind of a lot of things that you did from the Eagles' perspective to try to control the game and create the script that you wanted. You got all those. And yet still, Mahomes just got you. Like at the end of the day, like with Toradol and all, it was pretty unbelievable. So I love this game. I thought it was a fantastic Super Bowl. It flew by, I thought. It was like over in a blink. The rewatch was even better, I thought. I'm curious to hear what did you guys find interesting there?
Yeah, the fact that the Eagles were able to be as consistent as they were with Hurts being basically their running game, like the running backs really did not have a good game at all. Gainwell had a couple of nice plays, but like Miles Sanders was, from a total points perspective, was like one of the duds of the game. He's on his way out, presumably, and that's not, it puts a bit of a sour taste in your mouth if you're him. But the fact that they were able to move the ball as consistently, and the Eagles were much more consistently aggressive than the Chiefs were in terms of throwing the ball downfield. But yeah, Mahomes, I think he had like a 63% positive percentage on dropbacks, and that's like of the 500 quarterback games this year, that's like in the top 20. And so this is against a defense that isn't the 85 Bears, but like was a defense that you theoretically would have been worried about, and he just carved them up in not like a super dynamic way, but and actually the big thing that we haven't really talked about is the coaching staffs in terms of just like the offensive scheme of the Chiefs, just sort of like taking the Eagles behind the woodshed. And this is the sort of thing that we have a really hard time evaluating analytically, but it was very clear that from a scheme perspective, the Chiefs were like really did a great job.
Yeah, well, I thought the Eagles came out and they tried to stop Kelsey, and to the extent that they were successful with that, they didn't cover anybody else. And then you had these specific matchups where Bradbury was in man, which is not where you want Bradbury at his best. That ended up being a big play late in the game there. To your point, super fascinating that the Eagles, the great running team throughout the whole year, and the Chiefs never run the ball. And here it was that the Chiefs actually kind of hung with them in terms of getting some balance that way. Maybe you could say the pass rush was neutralized by the field. I think that's a legitimate case to be made for that. But certainly also somewhat by the running game there. By the same token, when you flipped it around the other way, you saw Spags really said, Jalen Hurts is going to have to beat us with his arm. And Jalen Hurts basically obliged, but it just wasn't enough.
Yeah, I was going to say, speaking with Jalen, I mean, Jalen played phenomenal coming in with his, with the bum shoulder that everyone thought that he could have been possibly more limited than what Mahomes was. And he comes in and throws the ball at the second highest ADOT of the season for him. Just the way he was executing the offense. I mean, granted, the one drop ball in the backfield hurts, but he was able to take control through the air and really manage the offense well.
Yeah, and talking about missed opportunities and like one play that changes things, like the bomb to Quez Watkins that's just like maybe it's a little bit beyond it, but honestly, it's like a dime and he doesn't come up with it. Quez Watkins had a couple of these plays over the course of the season that really drove some results for the team.
All right, Alex, I wanted to ask you about, I know you did some analysis into the jet motion that everybody was talking about, where the Chiefs a couple of times kind of had a player in jet motion, forcing an adjustment from the Eagles that they knew was going to be an adjustment in that situation, and then being able to exploit it. What did you see there?
Yeah, so the Chiefs use a lot of jet motion. They use it a little bit less than they did with Tyreek Hill in the fold, but they are one of the bigger jet motion teams. And when that person comes in motion, they target them over 10% of the time with a throw. And that's fourth most in the NFL since 2018. And they're combining it with, so that's a pretty high target rate when they do run it. And they're also one of the teams that calls it a lot. So in terms of just the sort of impact of jet motion on their offense, it's a pretty big deal. And those
so are there any other teams calling it as often or targeting it, doing both use and targeting it as much as they do?
The big ones, so the ones that are sort of the interesting comparison are the Rams and the Ravens, who run it a lot, but they are targeting it half as much. And so in terms of like the total number of times that they're throwing to jet motion players, like they end up being higher, but that's just because they're running it way more than the Chiefs. So the Chiefs are sort of the class of the league in terms of the extent to which jet motion is sort of part of the passing game, not just as like set dressing. But that motion where you're coming in one direction and you're actually being thrown to back the way you came, that happens like less than 3% of the time in general. And at the goal line, which is what both of these plays were, that happens like more like 7% of the time. So again, not that common that a player is being targeted sort of back where he came from on jet motion, but it does happen, more than twice as often near the goal line. So it's one of those things that the Eagles could have been worried about more. And obviously the way that they sort of like pass off players was the thing, but that was the reason why the Chiefs were able to exploit that. And actually just in terms of like the way that we track player stats, like those players who sort of passed off unsuccessfully and like left these guys wide open, like James Bradbury was one of those players, and he doesn't get charged with a touchdown allowed on those plays because he's running with somebody else. So I think these kinds of rules, the way that the defenses are calling things these days, makes it tough to handle those kinds of play designs, and also makes it tough for us to analyze those kinds of results.
Right. Yeah. It's easier to analyze this sort of like old school, like cover three beaters, and you can see which concepts and routes are the best at attacking that. It's harder to analyze the adjustments to the adjustments, which is really what they went after here. They saw that when they had that jet motion and they had that pass off right there, I think the first time dictated the matchup by getting, what was it? It was Kelsey against somebody who couldn't guard Kelsey. I'm trying to remember a linebacker.
Who among us can?
Yeah. But it was they had Slay against Kelsey, and they got Slay off of him the first time. And then the second time they ran it, it was just, oh crap, they're doing this thing again. Everybody panicked, and it was the wide open one. So certainly they were attacking that. They knew that would create a problem situation for them, where it was a situation where the defense, theoretically based on what they're doing, should switch, but based on the personnel, they really don't want to switch.
Well, yeah, and they're switching because the Chiefs use this very often, and very often they're targeting the player. Or, that player is going to be relevant to the play, and 90% of the time he's just continuing forward, right? And so it's not necessarily the wrong thing to do most of the time, because in other situations, right, if he comes across the formation and they're not doing that.
Oh, it's their rule for a reason. It's their rule for a reason.
Like, so
but Andy Reid is taking advantage of that.
Yeah. And that's where it's like, I don't know how much you can blame the Eagles for behaving that way. It's much more about being able to pick your spots and try to exploit it, because if you didn't have that rule, you would get destroyed by the jet motion in other ways.
Right. Yeah. It's football. So nothing's that cut and dry. All right. Awesome Super Bowl. Anything else before we kind of put a bow on that one? We talked about the offenses. We talked about the officials, sort of. Hurts, Mahomes, jet motion. Anything else?
I think talking about the Eagles defense's handling of the motion is a good segue into the new Cardinals coach.
Absolutely. On that note, we wanted to talk about coaching changes and the coaches that changed teams this year. 2 coordinators from the Eagles became head coaches, including the defensive coordinator, Jonathan Gannon. Alex, again, you're the Eagles expert of the crew. I got to ask you what you made of these. I know Noah Gatzik was excited to see Jonathan Gannon leave, which was, maybe perplexing from an outside point of view.
Yeah, I think I'm honestly more interested to see what the Eagles look like after that, because they also have like a whole bunch of free agents coming out of that defense. But the big sort of hallmark of what Gannon was bringing was a lot of like bend don't break, a lot of switching type stuff that we saw with, not work in the case of these sort of funky jet motion things. And it's very possible that that's the sort of thing that becomes, you can never make it like a primary part of the way that offenses attack the way that defenses are preparing, because then it's no longer a surprise. But it is a sort of thing to keep in mind. Of course, when you're a defensive coordinator becoming a head coach, there's probably only so much that you're going to sort of impose the way that you played defense on Arizona. And obviously, like, the Eagles had a lot of skillful players on the edge and in the defensive backfield. And so you don't want to make any big assumptions about how that team is going to function. I think I'm most curious about the offensive coaching staff that sort of gets built around that, to see if that offense can be a little bit more consistent and dynamic in a way that you really wanted to with Kingsbury.
That's interesting. You're interested in looking at it from the offensive point of view, because, when you look at, when you think about them just kind of on the surface, I'm pulling up the Cardinals, you kind of think of them as a better offensive team, but looking at the total points ranking this year, we have them as the bottom team in the NFL, including 29th on offense and 27th on defense. So it wasn't really pretty on either side. Still, you got to think, you've got Kyler. You can figure out how to build an offense around that, right?
Yeah, I would think so. The offense is less concerning to me. The interesting thing about this hire to me is how it's another example of how teams always try to do the exact opposite in a coaching hire of their previous coach. So, like, Cliff Kingsbury was a offensive college head coach, and now they go after an NFL defensive coordinator, which is about as opposite as you can get. I think I want to see how much Gannon can get out of the defense more than he can get out of the offense, because they have some interesting pieces on defense, namely Zaven Collins and Isaiah Simmons, who are sort of weird players in terms of body type.
Just freak athlete, like physical freaks. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think they were maximized very well in Kingsbury's tenure. So I would like to see what he can get out of those players. Like, I'm not expecting them to make a Super Bowl run in the first year, but if he can let Kyler do his thing on offense and not otherwise inhibit him in the ways that Kingsbury inhibited him, and at the same time get something out of those younger players they invested high draft picks in, I think that would be a really encouraging sign for me year one.
That'll be interesting, because the Eagles defense, talented as it was, did not have those kinds of players, right? Their linebackers were pretty not dynamic. And the only player who could sort of like flex between positions and be that sort of like dynamic athlete that can do multiple things is Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, who is a different, obviously a totally different kind of player. So we don't really have examples of Gannon working with those kinds of super athletes and especially the sort of linebacker position. So yeah, I definitely would be intrigued to see if he can get something out of them. We don't really have evidence one way or the other on that.
And I think, I don't know that much about Gannon historically, but if they build anything close to what they built with the Eagles here, the Eagles always have been, we want 8 dudes that can rush the passer up front. Got really thin at corner for a couple of years there, which was sort of their Achilles since their last Super Bowl win. But that got fixed up between Slay and Bradbury for sure. I think when you look at him going over to Arizona, the cupboard's pretty bare as far as the depth chart goes at all of the important positions, right? You mentioned those 2 really nice, shiny objects, but where are your corners? Where are your down linemen? All that kind of stuff. Like, we can't be like the JJ Watt show in 2023. So I look at it as they're probably going to become a base 4-3 team now, but they're probably going to be sort of hybrid like the Eagles were in the way that they would use Hassan Reddick, kind of more like an old school Sam that would come down and play on the line of scrimmage a lot in some of those over-under fronts. I see them making a big transition on defense. I get excited about what he can do there. And then I think the vision is like basically instead of, like you were saying, Bryce, the genius offensive coach that is going to make Kyler Murray get to the next level, they're just kind of like, all right, we got Kyler Murray. Let's make this his offense. And let's build somebody who knows how to build a really good defense to complement it. And that's their new recipe. It's funny, though. You did say that every team does that. Meanwhile, Shane Steichen, offensive coach from Philadelphia, hired by Indianapolis, if you don't count Jeff Saturday, to replace Frank Reich, offensive coach who came from Philadelphia. So not every team does it this way. Your favorite rational owner, Jim Irsay, behaving a little bit differently. Alex, what do you make of Steichen to Indy? And why might that go different than the Frank Reich era?
Yeah, so I mean, both of those offenses, the Frank Reich, Nick Foles offense and the Jalen Hurts, Shane Steichen offense, like they have kind of similar looks in terms of like the number of RPOs and keeping things relatively simple and quick reads and that sort of thing. The difference is that the offense relied a lot on Jalen Hurts' ability to decide at a certain point, like, I'll take a 2-yard scramble. And the Indy quarterback situation is like as big of a question mark as anybody's. And part of the problem with the previous coaching staff was that it was like that for those years as well, just sort of rotating between these guys coming from other teams. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how that offense will look with a different level of talent at quarterback, because you can get away with a more vanilla offense when you have a dynamic athlete at quarterback, and Indy does not have that.
Yet. We'll see. I don't know. I would have been really critical of the Eagles quarterback situation a couple of years ago, and certainly he's made lemonade there. I think that's the vision. I think that's Frank Reich made Carson Wentz was the perception, and so let's get that guy in here, the quarterback whisperer. I feel like they're going for that again. Makes sense when you look at the Colts roster with all the Pro Bowlers as of 2 years ago and the glaring hole at quarterback. I don't know if I would bet on Sam Ehlinger to become the next Jalen Hurts based on what he showed.
I think that's fair, but also, I don't think that people would have bet on Jalen Hurts that much, especially after his first foray. So I think we have, as you've talked about frequently on this podcast, there's a lot more evidence of quarterbacks being able to sort of learn accuracy and learn consistency in a way that they haven't previously.
And they got to be taking a quarterback this year, right? Like they've got.
I have to assume so. Yeah,
it's time. I mean, they put it off for long enough. Let's get this shot at the right.
So, I think Derek Carr is win-win. I think Derek Carr is a sort of rare free agent quarterback in that regard. I would probably rather pay Derek Carr than trade for Aaron Rodgers, even though Aaron Rodgers was the MVP 2 years ago and the year before that. So for a quarterback like that, I always like drafting a quarterback. Obviously, in terms of team building, you're going to have the cost-controlled answer there, and Derek Carr is not going to be that. But this is sort of like, okay, yeah, like Jimmy Garoppolo is another quarterback, but that's win in spite of level. A true win with free agent quarterback, I think, is actually out there. And there are a few teams with good rosters that I think the Colts could make an argument that they're one of, that if you wanted to go down that road.
Yeah, and they probably have some work to do rebuilding that offensive line a little bit, right? Obviously, they kind of took a little bit of a step back this year in terms of the pass rush scheme and things of that nature. I mean, obviously, Quentin Nelson's still there and is still one of the top guards in the league, if not the top guard. But they had some trouble.
I mean, they signed some of those guys to long deals, right? Like Braden Smith, I think, got a deal. I think Ryan Kelly got a deal. So I think I think those guys had a bad year this year, but I think those are their dudes for the most part.
Right. I guess to specify more a little bit on the left tackle spot, I think there might have been some injury concern there. There was a kind of a gaping hole there, but if they can maybe get that patch up in the draft, bring in a Derek Carr, then yeah, I can see that. I just don't know how much Mr. Irsay wants to see another free agent quarterback come in and turn into another disaster like it has the last 5 or 6 times now. And he also did mention that he is a big fan of Bryce Young, which lost all trade leverage in terms of saying, okay, Chicago being like, okay, well, if you want him, come get him. Here's our price. And it's going to go up every time you keep asking.
Pretty interesting.
I can't do Bryce Young discourse today. Not today.
Where do the Colts pick? They have a first-round pick? They're fourth.
They're fourth, yep.
Fourth.
Okay, so they're in the running for having their quarterback du jour at that spot. All right, let's keep it going. Off of the Indy coordinators, James, what did you think of the guy who left Indianapolis to go to Carolina, Frank Reich?
Yeah, I think a lot of the issue in Indianapolis was the quarterback situation. And obviously, Frank Reich going to Carolina does not have that settled either. But I think that was a great hire by the Panthers. And more so with bringing in him, the offensive-minded guy who's been around for a long time now, coaching in this league, was the experience and success they brought in on the assistant-level coordinator spots. Bringing in a Jairo Evero from the Broncos as your defensive coordinator was a huge get for them. Panthers ranked bottom 5 in total points in pass defense this year. And meanwhile, he coached the Broncos being number 2 in the league. You have talent there in J.C. Horn, who's still a young guy who's still learning how to play the game and has all the potential skill set in the world. And then also bring in Dom Capers, who's been around the league forever, obviously, with all of his experience as an defensive assistant. And then
before you were born, he was their first head coach.
Yeah, I read that one up. Yep, I did that because I had no clue. And then, bringing in Jim Caldwell, too, who had success in Indy and in Detroit, of all places. Sorry, Bryce. But just bringing that overall experience and just building up the roster, and still a young roster. So bringing all that experience to teach them up and coach them up. And we'll see what they do at quarterback, obviously, is the main concern. But, last year's draft bringing in Ike Ekwonu to shore up the offensive line a little bit. And everyone kind of forgets, but they were a win against Tampa away from winning the NFC South this year. And in taking a look at the NFC South next year, they're very much in the thick of it. And by the time the offseason dust settles, they could easily be the favorites to win that division. Yeah,
I agree with you. I think this is an awesome job. Look at them up front. When you pull up on the 33rdteam.com, if you look at their Sonar depth chart, it jumps out right away. And I know Alex and I were down visiting with the guys on the radio down in Charlotte, and they would agree. The tackle position is looking really good in terms of having the 2 bookends there for them. And the defensive line is ridiculous with this team. They are very strong up front on defense. They're strong up front on offense. That's exactly how you want to be built. Then you just got to figure out that quarterback situation. Now, they have no idea what they're doing there. People are thinking like, wait a minute, is Sam Darnold good because of the way he kind of finished the season? I don't know how far you want to go down that road. But heck, we've seen Geno Smith before. What'd you say?
I don't want to go down that road at all.
Far. And then, how far do you want to go down the road of, what's his name, who they drafted a year ago out of Mississippi? Corral. That's another one that's a total, they have no idea what they have in him because he was hurt most of the year this year, and they don't even have a read there. And then I think they're also a potential Derek Carr team. I think that they're also a potential draft team. But this is a roster that I really like.
Yeah, and then to add on to that, too, with their draft picks this year, trading away McCaffrey to the 49ers, they got the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th round picks this year. So they're going to have a lot of leeway and a lot of talent to build in, to bring in, evaluate, and fill some spots that they need to.
All right, keeping it moving around. Sean Payton to Denver. This has probably been discussed ad nauseum, but being that I spent some time in New Orleans with Coach Payton, I feel obligated to kind of opine on this one a little bit. Russell Wilson and Drew Brees were really different quarterbacks in a way that even though people would say they're both short quarterbacks, they're both athletic quarterbacks, there's obviously a huge difference in the way that they played. We could get Alex to probably draw up a nice chart to show the amount of stuff that Brees was doing within the schedule of the play and the amount of stuff that Russell Wilson was doing just to try to get off schedule. That was his kind of plan the whole time. What's interesting here is I think Coach Payton is about as well suited as anybody to teach Russell Wilson a little bit more of how to operate within the on-schedule stuff, to take some of that easy money. I think we'll see a Russell Wilson at 70% completions next year by the end of the year. I think we'll see running backs that have a lot more receiving yardage just based on different things there. I think the receiver group there is good and has been good for a while. I think there's exciting things to work with there. They've got to sort out the pass protection, but Coach Payton's going to sort that out. Like, he's going to demand that that gets sorted out organizationally. So I think that that's, they paid him a lot, obviously, but I think based on what I know, I think it's a really good fit in terms of if anybody's going to get Russell Wilson to do more of the on-schedule stuff, it's Coach Payton. And also, I think that's not just like Russ needs to adapt to what Coach Payton's going to do. I think it's one of those things where players want to be coached by coaches that can help them. I think he'll see that Coach Payton can help him, and that Coach Payton will be very happy when he does the off-schedule stuff too. Because when that's not the only thing that you're doing, that's a really big advantage, right? That's what makes Kyler Murray an attractive player to coach. So I love that there. They'll do some stuff to fix up, especially the interior of the offensive line. But I think it's a perfect fit in terms of that one. And I think they're going to be a team on the rise quickly.
I think the thing that I'm as optimistic about as anything is that there's no Taysom Hill analog that we need to worry about. So the offense can be a little simpler and a little bit less of, hey, look at the shiny thing. I'm going to do whatever I want with that thing. I think, yeah. I assume that we're assuming that Payton's doing the play calling and stuff like he has full control over the offense. Is that fair?
There's no doubt about it. No doubt about it. He's going to, I don't know what they're doing defensive coordinator wise. I haven't heard anything about that, but he's going to hire somebody that's going to run that, and he's going to be an overseer and the head coach, but he's going to let somebody run the defense.
Reports yesterday is that could be Rex Ryan.
That wouldn't surprise me at all. Towards the tail end of my time with him in New Orleans, we had Rob Ryan in there for a year. I think it was like one of the worst defenses in NFL history, if I remember correctly. But in fairness, Rob Ryan was trying to play with all players that were not fit for the scheme that he wanted to run at all. And you really do need, I'll give the Rob Ryan credit. I remember him coming in and saying, I just want good players and then I'll figure out how to use them. But at the end of the day, he needed people that could play man-to-man coverage. We didn't have people that could play man-to-man coverage. And so that was a little bit of a rub.
You guys are much more optimistic about this than I am. I like Sean Payton. I like the hire. I think that the Russell Wilson reconstruction project is going to prove very frustrating.
So say it proves frustrating. He'll move on, right?
But then it doesn't go well.
Yeah. That's not a so what. That's like we've traded a lot of picks and spent a lot of money for what?
Right.
Yeah, I'm not concerned about the trajectory of Sean Payton's life. I know very well that he could fuck off and retire again and do TV if he wants and be perfectly happy and comfortable. I don't know that things are going to end as happily for the Broncos.
My point is I think his best chance to succeed is with Russell Wilson. I don't think that if he doesn't succeed with Russell Wilson, he doesn't succeed.
I don't think Sean Payton's best chance to succeed is with Russell Wilson. I think Russell Wilson's best chance to succeed might be with Sean Payton, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, take him out of the equation, though. I mean, I don't know. You still have Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton. You've got a couple of capable running backs there. You've had a defense that's been really good for the past few years. Pat Surtain is there, sort of corner piece, the defensive player there. It's obviously you don't want to have traded away all the assets that you did, and even more assets now in terms of trading for Sean Payton himself. But all that said, it's not like losing a couple draft picks has really prevented a franchise from being able to build if they're doing intelligent things around that. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see.
I think the combination of them and the Rams is sort of an interesting case of teams that do lean into, like, I'm going to trade draft capital to get players or coaches. And if that's it's never going to be like a sustainable practice in the sense that like you're always going to end up getting expensive players who are on contracts it's going to
much more like baseball. We're used to seeing baseball teams make moves based on the win curve, right? Like the marginal value of a win is more if you have a chance of making the playoffs or going deep in the playoffs. So in those situations, you want assets for now, and when you suck, you're willing to get rid of those and take assets for later.
The difference is that in baseball, you have an entire minor league system in which you can develop people and get them meaningful playing time while your sort of team up top is performing differently. And so you can work around that in baseball in a way that you can't in the NFL.
I don't know if I agree with that. I thought you were going to say the difference is that in baseball, there's no hard cap. So literally the marginal value of a win is
Talk
more.
To the Mets.
But I don't know. I kind of think that, I don't know. I don't see the reason why, I guess is my question.
Yeah. And also there's not enough teams who are doing this that we can really feel confident that we're evaluating the process very much as opposed to the individuals involved. So.
All right. One more coaching change to talk about. D'Amico Ryans to Houston. I thought this was interesting because there are people comparing, like, would you rather have the Houston job or the Denver job? And a lot of people were saying Houston. And I get that with respect to the Russell Wilson, sort of Bryce Rossler perspective. But Houston hasn't exactly been normal functional the last few years. Is that a good job? Obviously, he thought it was a good job. That was the one that he wanted more for personal reasons, it seemed, than anything else. But can the Houston Texans be like a normal functional franchise going forward?
They just had such a weird season. And I know the whole question is, can they be normal? But like they were bizarrely competitive through, 3/4 of many games. And I don't know if that's like indicative of, like in the same way that we would say like late down performance is not something that we would project, like is losing games in the fourth quarter all the time something that we should ignore. And this team is actually, more successful than you'd think. And it really is on the come. But in terms of just like the talent that you look at on the roster, you certainly don't see it. And I absolutely am. I like the idea of Ryans coming back to Houston and that sort of thing. And that warms my heart or whatever. But yeah, this is definitely the one that I'm the most like curious about and have the least confidence in what I would expect from them.
I think Lovie Smith can coach defense, but he's not a head coach. And I think that's what they were. And then so they were in close games, but also like they were never really in those games a lot of the time until week 18, of course.
It shows like the organizational shift finally of going to a young up and coming coach coming from, what Lovie Smith and David Culley were. With no respect to them, obviously they had a lot of good responses from their players and everything like that, but showing like a new day, I guess to say. I go back and forth with the whole defensive coach, offensive coach thing. I think a defensive coach potentially raises your floor a little bit more, probably caps the ceiling. But with this being Ryan's first head coaching opportunity and not knowing a whole lot from San Francisco, I mean, he was only there for season or two now as a defensive coordinator after Saleh left. So, definitely a lot up in the air. But that's kind of my take with the defensive coach thing.
They really, I mean, if you're taking a defensive coach onto that roster, like you really need talent and coaching and quality coaching hire on the offensive side. Because they were definitely just like that defense is much more bankable than whatever they have on the offensive side.
And I think that's the danger of hiring a defensive coach in the modern NFL is if they do get somebody that's up to the task, that guy's gone. So unless it's Eric Bieniemy and people just refuse to hire him or something like that.
The easy and admittedly somewhat lazy worst case here, I think, is Robert Saleh, because he was the defensive coordinator of a very talented 49ers team and then went to the Jets.
Jets are kind of awesome except for their quarterback right now.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. Like, Houston is going to take a quarterback this year, right?
Yeah.
So
if they draft Zach Wilson, they're going to be as good as the Jets are. But if they draft Trevor Lawrence,
well, no, because
and they just went from having the number 1 pick to the number 2 pick by winning.
Yeah, well, that's a different conversation. But the Jets were in part really good because they spent a lot of draft capital on skill position players, right? Like they've taken a lot of picks on young, exciting skill position players that the Texans still have to acquire themselves.
Do the Texans have any safeties they can trade for multiple first-round picks?
Yeah.
Box safeties, preferably.
Yeah.
All right, before we get out of here, Alex, you wanted to call out a couple of the interesting coordinator moves. What do you got on that?
Yeah. So first is the sort of like tail between your legs story of Nathaniel Hackett going back as the Jets offensive coordinator. Speaking of the Jets and speaking of the Broncos, I think that situation, not all coordinators are well suited to head coaching jobs. And it's very possible that the people that we've already talked about today will be examples of that. But I think that I'm much more optimistic about the Jets offense with him compared to him getting a head coaching job somewhere else. So that feels like that worked out for him.
Are we sure he's suited to offensive coordinator jobs?
I mean, he's more suited than he was to a head coaching job. So it's a thumbs up in that sense. And
he had a very great tenure with the Jaguars. Very, very successful. Much success. Much good.
Well, the Jaguars also, I mean, we're talking about comparing to Houston, like they've not had a ton of offensive talent in the last several years. So I'm not as broken up about that.
Hey, turn Blake Bortles into something.
I don't know. Yeah, something is the right noun.
Yeah, something is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, James. I gotta say.
I think what's going on here is he spent the last year in the sensory deprivation chamber that they set up for him in Denver, and they're trying to get somebody else from that same chamber to meet him in New York. That's where I think this one's heading.
Fair enough. Yeah. So then
we're doing this again.
Yeah.
Answers coming from the chamber.
Yeah. So the other coordinator I was interested in was Kellen Moore to the Chargers. A lot of people have been frustrated with the Chargers offense and what they're not doing with the talent they have at quarterback and at receiver. So Moore does seem like a pretty optimistic hire for them. So that'll be cool. The guy who replaced him in Dallas, Brian Schottenheimer, not as much about the enthusiasm, but
no, the guy who's calling the plays now is going to be McCarthy,
right? Which
is like even less enthusiasm.
Yeah, so it's that's an interesting. I mean, go Birds, but it's an interesting set of choices. And then the last one I was kind of interested in was Brian Flores as the Minnesota defensive coordinator. And obviously he had a rough go of it over the last couple of years, but he was the reason he was hired as a head coach was because he had some really good defenses and he can coach them up. And that Minnesota defense was not great last year. So I'm pretty interested in how they might be able to perform more like an above average team as opposed to a team that was way ahead of their skis.
Great hire.
The Vikings,
love it.
Yeah, the Vikings also are going to enjoy the extra picks that they get when Brian Flores becomes a head coach himself in a year or two. So it really is a virtuous circle.
Also, I would just circling real quick back to the Chargers offensive coordinator. I would just like to point out that Joe Lombardi is maybe the greatest example of football nepotism to ever exist. And I'm not super enthusiastic about Kellen Moore, but instant upgrade for sure.
Yeah, I don't know if we've really been rough enough on Joe Lombardi this year. So I'm glad you said that. Thanks for pointing that out.
You can never be too rough on Joe Lombardi. I won't forget what he did to the Lions.
Never forget. On that note, we'll sign off and get out of here. For our producer, Justin Stein, and the entire SIS Football Research Jamboree, Alex Vigderman, James Weaver, and Bryce Rossler, I'm Matt Manocherian, and thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast.